Hello, and thank you for coming along today. Today we're going to consider the question, what have we learned from the global virus? The COVID-19 virus has invaded the world, and we're basically in a very new circumstance than we were just 2 weeks ago, a month ago, and certainly 6 months ago. But what have we learned from this global virus about other things like the vulnerability of the global food system and the strategies needed for a sustainable recovery? System vulnerabilities are a general problem. We can learn a great deal about the vulnerabilities of any system, when we witness how it breaks down. We can see how it is put together by observing carefully how and why it falls apart. What do we see in the news? In the news, we can see a number of things. First of all, in the news, even prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the world's food systems were already very precarious. The UN report on food security and nutrition made this clear in July of 2019, a full 5 or 6 months before COVID-19 became an issue.
For decades, the number of hungry people had been declining. This isn't true anymore. Today, achieving the Zero Hunger goal by 2030 is becoming more challenging. More than 820 million people still do not have enough to eat. Hunger is increasing in many countries where economic growth is lagging, particularly in middle-income countries. Rising unemployment and declining wages and incomes are challenging people's access to nutritious foods and essential services such as healthcare. Income inequality is rising in many of the countries where hunger is on the rise, making it even more difficult for the poor to cope with economic slowdowns. Conflict and climate change are also driving hunger. Unless greater investments and more targeted efforts are made to address these drivers, we will not meet the goal of ending hunger. The Zero Hunger goal is not simply to eradicate hunger, but to ensure that all people have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, and to end all forms of malnutrition. This year's State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2019 report goes beyond hunger. For the first time, it provides estimates of the people who face uncertainties about obtaining food, the moderately food insecure. Today, over 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe, nutritious and sufficient food, a problem that affects people not only in low and middle-income countries, but also in high-income countries. The chances of being food insecure are higher for women than men in every continent, with the largest gap in Latin America. Too many children suffer from low birth weight or stunted growth. At the same time, no region is exempt from the epidemic of overweight and obesity. Overweight and obesity have increased in all regions, particularly among school-aged children and adults. But obesity is not the opposite of hunger. They can actually be linked. There are many reasons for this. First, fresh nutritious foods are often more costly and less available than highly processed foods, high in fats and sugars. Another reason is that the stress of living with uncertain access to food and food restrictions can cause physiological changes that increase the risk of overweight and obesity. And lastly, a malnourished child has a higher risk of obesity later in life. There are other repercussions of malnutrition. The economic costs of malnutrition are staggering. Obesity alone could cost $2 trillion annually in lost economic productivity and healthcare costs worldwide. And undernutrition would reduce gross domestic product by up to 11% in Africa and Asia. Our food systems are broken, and unless bolder actions are taken soon, humanity is at grave risk of seeing a continued rise in rates of hunger, obesity, and diet-related chronic diseases. To fix our food system, we must work together. Our actions must be focused on collaboration, stretching across borders from agriculture, food, health and water to education, social protection and economic policies. Countries need to integrate food security and nutrition into broader efforts to reduce poverty and gender inequalities. Ending hunger and all forms of malnutrition by 2030 is an immense challenge, but with real political commitment, bolder actions and the right investments, zero hunger is still achievable.
COVID-19 further aggravated the global food insecurity, and the UN agencies warned of an impending crisis.
Panic has hit the grocery aisles. Qu Dongyu, the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, made an appeal recently, urging international efforts to minimize the pandemic's impact on food supply chains and to prevent a food crisis. Moves by some countries are affecting supply. Kazakhstan has banned exports of wheat flour, buckwheat, sugar, and some vegetables. Russia has suspended processed grain exports. Vietnam, the world's third largest rice exporter, is stockpiling rice and has suspended new export contracts. Labor is another concern. Farmers have to live by the rules of nature. In some parts of the world, the spring is critical for planting and harvests. But the travel restrictions are not helping.
Farms and food producers are severely affected by the entry ban on seasonal hens, which German government has imposed. Normally, there are some 30,000 farm hens needed in March, not only in the asparagus harvest, but also in seeding and planting. And in May, some 80,000 are needed.
The picture is not all gloomy. Countries are working to make sure prices remain stable. China has stepped up efforts to boost the pork supplies and to curb rising prices, including releasing more frozen meat from reserves, boosting production, and raising meat imports.
We provide direct services from Toronto to Yangshan Port in Shanghai. It only takes 14 days.
The Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization said a globally coordinated response is needed, warning that this pandemic should not become a hunger game. Wang Siwen, CGTN.
There are many problems in the food delivery and supply chains, as well as with agricultural labor conditions across the country in the United States.
In other news tonight, we are seeing signs that the country's food supply chain is under significant stress. Here are two scenes. These are the enormous lines for the LA Regional Food Bank over the weekend, with cars stretching for miles. We've seen this kind of scene play out all over the country. People are desperate for food. They're having trouble feeding their families, their kids particularly. And here's another scene. This is what some dairy farmers are doing, dumping out thousands of gallons of fresh milk every day. Other farmers are destroying crops outright, plowing, for instance, ripe vegetables right back into the ground. Because with restaurants, schools, and hotels and other things closed, farmers that are part of the commercial food supply chain just don't have anywhere to sell their products. Also, the frontline workers, those that are keeping the food chain going, they are clearly at tremendous risk. They're still in the fields picking produce with minimal to no protection, particularly immigrants without papers. This is what it looks like inside a pork processing plant. People working there have to stand shoulder to shoulder. Yesterday, one of the largest plants in the country shut down in South Dakota indefinitely after nearly 300 employees tested positive for coronavirus. That's nearly a third of the cases in the entire state. The food supply chain is one of those things the vast majority of us, I think, tend to take for granted. We go to a restaurant or a grocery store or a fast food chain and the food is just there. But this crisis is putting stress on all parts of it from every angle. Last week, we brought you an interesting story about our toilet paper supply. And that reporting showed that the reason there's a shortage of toilet paper at stores is only really partly because people are hoarding this stuff. It's more because the industry is split into two markets. There's a commercial one and a consumer one. And everyone at home is now using the consumer product, And the commercial one, the one that's usually given to businesses and campuses and office buildings, cannot be easily made available for residential use. Well, guess what? It turns out the food supply chain is structured in a similar way. While grocery stores are having a hard time keeping things in stock, there is an entire food chain designed to sell bulk food to fast food stores and restaurants that is essentially being left to rot. And that is because a supply chain, as one dairy industry advocate explains, is tough to just switch around.
Because oftentimes the packaging and the size of the product that's delivered to grocery stores or distributed through those avenues of food service are much larger and not necessarily for family use.
This weekend, Wall Street Journal's agriculture reporter Jesse Newman wrote about coronavirus's impact on our food supply chain, specifically why farmers are dumping milk and breaking eggs in the middle of a pandemic. Jesse Newman joins me now. And Jesse, you've been doing great reporting on this that I've been following avidly. Talk to me a little bit about this conundrum here, the paradox of these sort of two supply chains, and the fact that one of them is so in sort of disuse at this strange moment that there's tons of food being produced with nowhere to go.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really strange situation that farmers and food producers find themselves in. You know, in the past few months since all of this began, we've seen just massive upheaval in the food supply chain. And, you know, at the beginning, we saw consumers flocking to grocery stores and clearing shelves of just about every product in anticipation of weeks and months at home.
Many in the northeastern U.S. realized that there was a global food problem when they learned of food lines nearby in Massachusetts. Then there was the problem of the health and safety of workers in the food chain, including meat processing plants, as well as a whole series of other institutions like prisons and nursing homes. The meat processing plants became an issue with reference to the general food supply of the population.
Your message is pretty clear about where we should be concentrating our efforts on coronavirus spread in the United States. What are you seeing in the efforts that the United States is making? Are we getting even close to targeting this correctly?
Well, I think as we're starting to have talk about reopening the U.S. economy, we need to focus on the cases where work becomes even more deadly. And right now, marginalized and low-wage work is a source of super spreader clusters in the United States. These are cases in which people have really low agency at work. They're often low paid and they have almost zero safety net to fall back on. So we're asking our essential workers to be, in effect, sacrificial workers.
The critique that has been made for a long time was that, in fact, American and international systems of poultry and livestock rearing have led to huge problems of public health with the overuse of antibiotics and the systematic crowding of animals under conditions which allow for the rapid transmission of epizootics, that is, epidemics among animal populations in confined feeding operations known as CAFOs. As one article and book put it, big farms make big flu. Large agribusiness firms are poised to profit from the post-COVID-19 crisis by arguing that they have the best means, and they are the best means to solve the global food problems. But others are pointing out that industrial agriculture is the source of the global food problem and must not be allowed to dominate the post-COVID-19 recovery.
The world's population keeps growing. By 2050, we'll have to double our food production. For that, we'll need genetic engineering, advanced pesticides, and fertilizer. Lots of fertilizer. That's why at Agricon, we're working every day, hand in hand with farmers and their families. And don't you want to feed the world?
Messages like this one seem to be popping up everywhere, but who's really behind them? Turns out it's the corporations profiting from this way of farming, like those selling the pesticides, fertilizers, and chemicals. They're spending billions to warn us that their way is the only way, with industry groups like the Alliance to Feed the Future, whose members include the Association for Dressings and Sauces and the National Frozen Pizza Institute. But ask farmers who really know how to feed us, and you'll get a very different story. A heartbreaking and hopeful story that I've heard talking to hundreds of families like this one. 50 years of this myth and the lobbying dollars to support it have tilted the playing field to favor corporate-controlled chemical agriculture, giving farmers little or no support for any other path. So it's easy to understand a lot of farmers feel it's either get on board or get out. Getting on board means farmers stop practices that keep soil healthy and go for single crops. Livestock that used to be raised on the farm get crammed into polluting factories. To keep this unnatural system going, these farmers now buy expensive inputs, all from ever fewer corporations demanding ever-rising prices. It's a quick addiction. Pests become resistant, so you've got to use more chemicals. Livestock becomes sicker, so you've got to use more drugs. Soil loses its natural fertility, so you've got to use more chemical fertilizer. Then on the other side, when farmers try to sell their crops, they face only a few big buyers offering unpredictable prices. The economics don't work for long. Over the last 50 years, millions of desperate farmers have had to sign contracts with corporations that dictate their every move, or have lost their farms altogether. More and more farm income is concentrating at the top, so now only 1 in 10 U.S. farms can support a family. In many other countries, a similar thing is happening. Small farmers who buy into the promise that corporate agriculture is the solution often get trapped by debt and dependency. So yes, corporate agriculture is good for some folks, including some of the largest growers, but not the typical farm family. And that's strike one for this myth. But we have to feed the world, right? And if not this way, what choice do we have? A great one. We just don't see ads for it, and it certainly isn't getting the subsidies going to corporate ags. State-of-the-art sustainable farming ends this unnatural chemical addiction. It uses better practices, not ever more expensive purchases. Sustainable farmers build healthy soil by planting a variety of crops and rotating them. They raise their animals on the farm, not in cramped factories. They fertilize using compost and livestock or planting soil-nourishing crops. Healthier plants with good crop rotation also help keep pests in check without hurting the bugs we need, like those all-important pollinators. How does this choice impact everyone else? Massively. Industrial farms degrade and erode precious topsoil. 64 tons per acre are being lost every year in some spots in our heartland. They suck up huge amounts of water, a lot of it from deep underground, essentially irreplaceable. And they use millions of pounds of antibiotics, a practice that leads to dangerous new bacteria. They also produce toxic runoff that pollutes our rivers, our oceans, and us. The average American already has at least 13 pesticides in our bodies. And thanks to chemicals in the field, farmers and farm workers have higher rates of many cancers. So the sustainable farm is better for farmers and the environment. But can it really feed the world? Study after study is saying yes. Sustainable farms produce as well, and in drought years, even better. This is important news for small farmers who already grow 70% of the world's food. To increase production, they don't have to follow the chemical path. And the future we're all talking about feeding? The industrial farm requires more fossil fuels, water, and mined minerals, all stuff that will only get more expensive as it runs out. So down the line, the chemical path not only can't work for farmers, it won't be a choice at all. Corporate agriculture doesn't reliably grow more food in the future or even today. And that's strike two for this myth. But we still haven't looked at the biggest hole of all. They say we need to double food production or we'll go hungry. Really? We already have almost 3,000 calories a day available for every human being on Earth. More than enough. And that's after wasting a third of all food grown. And a lot of what is grown isn't food we eat directly. A third of the world's grain is going to livestock. In the US, our biggest crop is corn, but less than 1% of all corn planted is what we eat. Most goes to fuel or feed. So staying on this track, we could increase production and still have more hunger. To end it, everybody has to have the power to buy or grow the food they need. And that's what sustainable farming is all about. Strike three for this dangerous myth. So the next time someone who makes frozen pizza or toxic pesticides tells you there's only one way to feed the future, tell them their story is full of holes.
As the COVID-19 crisis has revealed, the global food system has several key vulnerabilities built into it. It is very decentralized but tightly knit, with large transportation costs, having become highly dependent, and increasingly so, upon fossil fuels for nationwide and international transportation. Much of the labor involved in food production has been replaced by machines. This in itself changes the nature of the food supply. Highly mechanized agriculture reduces the diversity of crops grown and animals reared. Plants and animals are selected that work best with the machines. Uniformity and genetic uniformity is often selected for in these large agribusiness firms. It's increasingly using more and more fossil fuels for fertilizer, mechanical farming, sowing, harvesting, meat production, processing, and transporting food to cities. And all of this makes fossil fuel intensive, their production system that they've adopted. The trouble is that no civilization can survive if its primary production system, that is its agriculture, becomes dependent upon non-renewables, whether non-renewables like water that run dry in droughts, or non-renewables like topsoil that disappear in floods. Yes, geologically, those can be restored, but only over decades or perhaps hundreds and thousands of years in the case of topsoil. So in effect, both water and soil can be made from renewables into non-renewables by the practices of agriculture that dominate in any particular culture. If we turn renewables into non-renewables and increasingly use fossilized fuels, we're becoming very, very vulnerable as a global human community. We simply cannot have a food production system that's dependent upon non-renewables. It simply cannot and will not be renewed. We've highlighted, presented, and discussed many of these issues in previous programs. The question remains whether or not, in planning for the recovery after COVID-19, we will address and overcome these problems or accentuate them and thereby assure the collapse of our civilization. In the past, we've been looking in programs at killing the soil that feeds us, food, profit, and the fatal impact of petro-dependent agriculture. We've looked historically at the rise and fall of civilizations, including an intricate study of the collapse of complex societies in the past, and emphasizing the point that soil scientists have made for decades, that all civilization is dependent upon the health of the soil. We can even easily overshoot and collapse. It's very much more difficult to plan for stability and continuity. Agriculture, topsoil, and the ecology of colonialism made it clear, as it is to any colonial historian, that it was topsoil itself that drew settlers out of Europe to many parts of the world, what are often referred to as white settler societies in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Kenya, South Africa. These are white settler societies, and they have come to dominate the world since 1492. In fact, the globalization of food production with the emergence of the Atlantic plantation system is really at the origins of Africa's food crisis. And if you look at historical maps that illustrate this from the slave trade onwards, it's really extraordinary that a continent with the most continuous sunshine is in a food crisis. Climate change and the structure of the global food system has been emphasized as well. It's possible to make a transition towards sustainable agriculture, which actually fixes CO2 in the soil as carbon, rather than releasing it as mechanical agricultural systems do. This has been referred to as restorative development by Professor William Mumma and others who've been working on it for decades. And in fact, it's been pointed out at the same time and in the same venues, in this case in the US Senate, as long back as 1988, over 30 years ago, with testimony to the Senate about the problem of carbon in the atmosphere and how it needs to be retained in the soils. We've looked particularly at climate change, soils, and humans as a keystone species in restoring global ecosystems. We don't grow plants, we grow soil, and soil grows plants. If we're destroying topsoil, we're in real trouble here because we're losing our capacity to fix carbon from the atmosphere into the soils. This point has been made most recently after 33 years of teaching on the subject at the UN back in early 2019, before the UN's report on food security and nutrition, in which they make it clear that the food systems are broken. Scholars have made this point for decades, and it's now becoming apparent. This is the kind of thing, in fact, in transition studies you can look at by going to their online courses and setting up your own course, in effect, creating some of the material for others to learn from and share by going to the self-guided inquiry and learn how to set up your own curriculum on this kind of crucial issue.